I'm going to be reading in Ephesians 5, starting in verse 15. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Wherefore, be not unwise, but understanding that what the will of the Lord is. And be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things unto God and the Father in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. This is God's word.
All right, so over the last few weeks, we've been looking at the, you can turn this down a little bit. It's about to go into feedback. We've been looking at a number of different things, how we walk. We've talked about walking in light, and we've talked about walking in love, and we've talked about walking in honesty or integrity. And all of this comes where Paul starts it saying we should not walk the way the Gentiles walk. And what he means by that is that, and he says the Gentiles, and we've tried to point this out, that what Paul is saying is not that the Gentiles are terrible and we're critical of them. But what he's saying is the Gentiles, those that don't know Christ, they walk as purely materialists, essentially is what he's saying if we put it into modern lingo. They walk as viscerally, reactively, not intelligently, not rationally. And in an incredible reversal of what people think of today of religion and non-religion, Paul is saying that Christianity is about thinking. It is about having knowledge and understanding and using your mind, using your logic, your rationale in order to order your life properly, not just doing things. And see, that's how it's reversed. People many times a day think that Christianity, it's all about just blindly believing and doing what you're told. That is not biblical Christianity. That is not it. And so it's very important that we understand. So then Paul goes through those things and says, what does that mean to walk intelligently? Well, he says, well, that means you need to walk in light, and you need to walk in honesty, and you need to walk in love, and you need to walk in these. These are the ways you need to walk. Now we're going to get to the last one, which really is kind of some commentators have called it the climax of this whole section. It's kind of where he's going with all of these things he's mentioned. He says we need to walk in wisdom. We need to walk wisely. We could say that wisdom is not just another one of the principles that he's gone through. It's really the overarching principle. It's the grand narrative of all the others. What is it? What it summarizes all of them and encapsulates all of them. And yet it's far more than that. What is wisdom? So there's a lot of ways of defining it, and I'm not trying to say that any of the others are wrong, but as I look at what I think Paul is trying to get across, and in putting that in the context of how the Bible deals with wisdom, this is how I would define wisdom for you this morning. Wisdom is an acknowledgement of and a commitment to dealing with the full complexities of reality. I'm going to say that again, because I tend to make things too complicated. Wisdom is an acknowledgement of and a commitment to dealing with the full complexities of reality. So it's not just about conjuring up solutions and answers. Wisdom isn't answers. A lot of times we think of it that way. We think of wisdom means I have an answer to all the questions. Wisdom isn't answers. Wisdom is acknowledging that reality is incredibly complex and being committed to dealing with situations across what we might call the laminated reality. The problem in the world today, if you're at all engaged in the modern world, and a lot of us aren't. Some of you are too old to even know the modern world is there anymore, right? I don't want to point fingers at anyone, but others simply have never really cared, and maybe you're able to live like an isolated existence, and you don't really have to deal with academia. You don't have to deal with science. You don't have to deal with maybe you don't care much for university or college, and you didn't go to there. You don't watch a lot of news, and so you don't deal with the way the world is today. But most of us, I think, do. And what we find is that we have a world that has been delaminated. It's been reduced down to a single layer. Everything is materialist. And that's not just an interpretation of my own. They themselves would say there is nothing in the world beyond what is material. And so everything has to be explained from a materialist standpoint. Well, that's a delamination of reality. That is saying that reality exists only on a physical plane. Now, the world has been trying very hard to push that view and try to prove that view. And they're having a very hard time. Just recently, I've had some discussions with a number of people on what's called the mind-body problem. If you want to get into the weeds a little bit on where materialists really have a hard time with their delaminated view of reality, then you should read a few of the books on mind-body problem, and you can see where they themselves are coming up against some very difficult questions that the materialist-only view has a hard time answering. Christian wisdom, to get back to our point, Christian wisdom is to acknowledge that the world is not just one layer. Now, I'm not here to try to define or tell you conclusively how many layers there are or whatever. I'm just saying that there is more to the world than just what's physical. We could say that the world might be physical. There might be, we could call a psychological or mental component to the world, what we would think of as the mind. But then we also, in the Bible, most importantly find that it teaches us that there is a spiritual component to the world. Wisdom is interacting with issues on all those layers, acknowledging that all those layers exist, and trying to interact with them across them all. So you can't just solve a problem of an unruly child on a physical layer. Now, Christians may think of themselves very highly and think, well, we believe in the spiritual, and yet many Christian parents try to deal with their children merely on the layer of the buttocks. And that is not a Christian view of how to properly raise a child. And so Christian wisdom is to look at the world across many layers and acknowledge that there's more to things, all things, than just what meets the eye. And to try to account for all those and try to deal with these situations across those. And that makes it very hard. And there's many of us who would just say, you know what, I'd rather have the materialist worldview because it sounds much simpler. It is much simpler. And that's why wisdom is one of the largest subjects in the scriptures. As Mike said in the open meeting, there's an entire section of the scriptures that is called wisdom literature. Now, we all would immediately think of Proverbs, right? That's like wisdom, yes, true, but it's not the only one. Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and most of the Psalms are considered wisdom literature. Now, we don't always read the Psalms and think this is wisdom literature, but it is, and we'll see that that is exactly what Paul is evoking when he writes this passage. He is an Old Testament Jew, writing from that worldview, that perspective. And his perspective, when he talks about wisdom, he's thinking Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, parts of the other old parts of the Old Testament, the Song of Moses, the Song of Miriam. These would all generally fall into the categories of wisdom literature, where you're not going to find answers, but you are going to find insight. And see, that's what wisdom is about. We want answers. We live in a materialist, scientific worldview culture, and what we want in the world is we want answers. And we Christians make a huge mistake many times by thinking of the Bible as an answer book. Now, it does have many answers to some things, but a lot fewer than what people would like. So wisdom is that. There was a young college professor at the start of World War II who lived in northern China. And at that time, northern China was under the rule of the Japanese. The Japanese were the world power in that area of the world. And when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they did the same thing that the U.S. government did. They went into all their territories and they rounded up anybody who was of a nationality of their enemies. So in this case, they rounded up the British, the Americans, the Australians, Catholic priests, Jesuits, whoever was of the nationalities of their belligerent nations. They rounded up and put them in internment camps. And Langdon Gilkey, young man, professor in a college in northern China, which was partially under British rule and then got overrun by the Japanese. He went into what's called the Shangtung compound. You may not have heard of that, but you've probably heard of one of the inmates of the Shangtung compound, which was Eric Liddell. If you don't know who the name, you might know him from the movie Chariots of Fire. He's the main protagonist in Chariots of Fire, the Presbyterian minister who was extremely fast, went to the Olympics, but refused to compete in his 100-meter run because one of the heats would have been on Sunday, the qualifying heat. And so he refused to compete. And you can watch, it's a fantastic movie, one of the great movies of all time, Chariots of Fire. Eric Liddell was in the Shangtung compound with Langdon Gilkey. In fact, Langdon Gilkey in his book, which was called Shangtung Compound, writes about Eric Liddell a little bit in there. So if you want a little insight into Eric Liddell's life, he mentions him. Anyways, Langdon Gilkey, after he graduates from university and moves to China and starts teaching, he becomes interested in theology and in religion. And he starts studying it and reading it and becoming very interested in it and finding it very, very fulfilling in some ways. And in some ways, he said he found himself, at least intellectually, identifying as Christian. But when he gets into the compound, even though they were not mistreated per se by the Japanese like many others were, and I've mentioned other books that deal with Japanese internment camps, and there was terrible abuse in others, but in this one, which was full of academics, and like a third of them were missionaries and Catholic priests, the Japanese were not abusive to them at all. But being World War II, times of depression worldwide, there was a tremendous dearth of material. So they were hungry. They were living in little shacks. They were cramped into small spaces. So there was a lot of discomfort and those issues, but they weren't necessarily abused. And so they're in this compound. They try to set up a civilization. He says that when he went into that compound, he just lost all taste for religion. It seemed to him that was not something that anyone needed in dire situations. I mean, if you're in an internment camp, the last thing he thinks you need to do is say, where are we going to build a church? We need to think, where are we going to eat? How are we going to feed ourselves? How are we not going to freeze to death in the bitter, wet northern Chinese winters? That seems to be what matters. And these priests and all these missionaries who are holding church services and they're singing and they're praying, that just seems like a complete waste of energy and time that could be better spent. And so he just completely drew away from his religious interests. This is what he writes. After a few months of being there, he wrote that he had kept a journal and he published it. And this is what he wrote. He says, he began to realize that this confident attitude towards things simply did not fit the realities of camp life. It was not that our material crisis seemed any less urgent or that our minds were any less capable of dealing with them. Rather, new sorts of problems kept arising that improved know-how could not resolve. For over and over, what we could only call moral or spiritual difficulties continually cropped up. Crises occurred that involved not a breakdown in techniques, but a breakdown in character, showing the need for more moral integrity and self-sacrifice. He says, the trouble with my new humanism, I found myself deciding, was not its confidence in human science and technology. It was rather its naive and unrealistic faith in the rationality and goodness of men who yielded them as instruments. What he's saying is, and this is what he finds, you should read the book, it's a great book. What he says in the book is, they didn't have any difficulties from the war really, or from the Japanese. But they were in constant danger of devolving into utter chaos. And the reason, he says, is not because they were lacking any technology. They had a camp full of professionals. These were all professors and CEOs of oil companies and leaders in business, entrepreneurs. These were the creme of the creme in this compound. Anything they needed for leadership, for technology, for building things, everything they needed, they had everything they needed on that single unlaminated layer of society, that physical, materialist layer. They had what they needed. And yet their camp was continually on the verge of self-destruction. And he says he realized it was because there's more to life than just food and raiment. Food and clothing. There are moral and spiritual realities that a materialist worldview cannot address. And he became a Christian and a theologian from his experience in that camp, because he came up against this thing, and that is that knowledge is not enough. Knowledge is not enough. You have to have wisdom. And too many Christians make the mistake of thinking that because they have the Bible, they simply have answers. Tim Keller, in a book he wrote back in like 2014, I think it was, the book's called Every Good Endeavor. He writes this. He says, it is certainly true that in the Bible, Christians receive many practical, ethical principles for how to live, and many boundary markers showing us what behavior we must completely avoid. If that were all God provided us, it would be helpful, but it would be insufficient, because there is a whole category missing: wisdom. According to the Bible, wisdom is more than just obeying God's ethical norms. It is knowing the right thing to do in the 80% of life's situations in which the moral rules don't provide the clear answer. There is no biblical law that tells you what job to take, whether to go back to school, whom to marry or befriend, when to speak out or hold your peace, whether to make a deal or walk away from it. And yet the wrong decisions in all those things, this is what Tim Keller writes, the wrong decisions in all those things can blow up your life. So if the Bible doesn't tell us what job to take, and it doesn't tell us, if it doesn't tell us who to marry, and it doesn't tell us, then what do we have? Well, what Keller argues in his book, and what Gilkey argues in his, and what many people have pointed out, and what Paul is saying here is, to the Ephesians, you need wisdom. Ephesians isn't nearly a long enough book to give the Ephesian Christians all the answers to their dilemmas. We have repeatedly talked about what their what their context, their cultural and historical context was. Imagine yourself, and I'll ask you, imagine yourself again as a Christian in Ephesus, recently converted, surrounded by a city beyond your wildest dreams in perversity and depravity. And you, up until just the day before yesterday, were every bit a part of it. And everyone expects you to continue to be a part of it. Do you have any questions? Do you think Ephesians answers those questions? I don't think Ephesians comes close to answering the questions in the way that most of us often are looking for these direct answers that are like clear-cut, proof text answers. Give it to me. Just tell me what I do and I'll do it. And we read Ephesians, it doesn't sound like the answers we're usually looking for. But again, I want you to remember what Paul is doing in Ephesians, and he evokes this here, is he's speaking from an Old Testament view of wisdom. He says you need to walk wisely. This is a huge thing. It's small words, it's a short sentence, but it is a massive thing he's saying here. He is saying there are infinite things that I can't and won't answer for you, and you're going to have to figure them out based on transcendental principles. You're going to have to work it out. You're going to have to think it out. You're going to have to plan it out. You're going to have to pray it out. And you're going to get it wrong sometimes. And it's not always going to be clear to everybody that you got it right. That's one of the curious things. Like Proverbs has a number of places where it makes it super clear. For instance, you go to Proverbs in one place and it says, don't answer the fool in his folly. There you go. Now you have an answer, right? You have an answer. Here's a fool and he's saying stupid things. Don't answer him. There's your answer. Proof text. The very next sentence, what does it say? Answer the fool in his folly. Well, which is it? Is it answer him or answer him? And the answer is yes. Yes. That's not the only one. Proverbs is full of these irritating places. He says if you don't have any oxen, your barn will be clean, but your fields will be empty. See, wisdom is about understanding trade-offs. It's about understanding the complexity of reality and dealing with it on that level. The Ephesians, they had also a source of wisdom. And this is going to be awful strange to some of us because of our puritanical background in America. So the Ephesians, and this is why Paul mentions it. So he says we need to walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. And then he says what appears to be like a teetotaling proof text, don't be drunk with wine wherein is excess, which seems to just come out of nowhere. But we go back and we look at Ephesian history and their culture. And not just the Ephesians, but this was pretty widespread amongst the Hellenistic societies, Greek societies. They believed that by worshiping Dionysus, or as the Ephesians would call him Bacchus, was another name for the same god, a Greek god, the god of wine, the god of ribaldry, the god of scandal. When you worship Dionysius properly, through drunkenness and revelry, Dionysius would fill you with wisdom. In fact, there's a number of ancient writers. For instance, if you go and look up and read, you can download Plutarch's Lives, and he has a section in there on his lives on Mark Antony, talking about when the Roman general Mark Antony rode into Ephesus. He styled himself as Dionysius. That's how he presented. He believed himself to be the incarnation of this God, and the Ephesians welcomed him as that. And this whole procession for Mark Antony through Ephesus itself, shortly before the time when Ephesians is written, was a drunken procession in worship of Mark Antony with the hope that they would be filled with his spirit. Euripides wrote a play called the Bacchanals, which are the worshippers of Bacchus, Dionysius, who also has a very similar, although fictional, account of the same thing. So here's what the Ephesians thought. They believed that you could achieve wisdom through drunkenness. That's where wisdom came from. Now, you and I have looked at the consequences of drunkenness in drunk driving, in domestic violence, and we think, well, that's just absurd. And it is absurd. But so is the idea that psychedelics are going to give you wisdom. That's absurd too, even though that's a lot more acceptable today. Especially if you like listening to podcasts. There are major podcasters who are promoting the idea that psychedelics and getting high is the path to spiritual enlightenment. This is the same error that Paul is dealing with here. There's a debunked quasi-historian by the name of John Marco Allegro, who has written that Christianity was essentially a psychedelic mushroom cult that got all of their revelation and the idea of the resurrection. All of this came through psychedelic experiences. Never mind that there is zero evidence of this. And any of these things, you should always take one serious thing into account. When you hear people say, well, Christianity this, or the Bible was this, and they make these wild claims, you think, remember one thing. There is no movement, there is no book, there is no ideology that has been more carefully scrutinized by more people over more time with more resources than Christianity and the Bible. When people say, oh, we found something that no one ever, that's just nonsense. The Bible has been pored over by thousands and hundreds of thousands of people looking for every minute problem for 2,000 years at least. Paul is coming out and saying Christianity, we Christians are not filled with the Spirit through drunkenness, through mind-altering substances. It is, if he was writing today, he would say, don't be high on dope. Now, I'm not here trying to preach prohibitionism or teetotalism. That is not what I'm saying. Paul is not saying do not drink alcohol. That is not what he's saying. I know there are Christians who believe that the Bible is against any drinking of any alcohol whatsoever. That is not the case. What Paul is saying here to the Ephesians is that your view that the way to which you acquire the spirit of wisdom is through a drunken religious ritual is false. Now, you and I may think kind of odd thing to state or to say. It's like, why would you need to say such a thing? But that's because you're not living in a culture that believes that religious ritual is the source of wisdom. We look at drunkenness as at best an activity of leisure, not one you do as religious ritual. The Ephesians say, well, how are we going to be wise? Their entire life, their upbringing for way back, we're talking about hundreds of years, has been that the god Dionysius will grant his spirit in you if you get drunk enough and worship with I'm trying to speak to a mixed crowd, worship with perverted orgies in his temple. He will fill you with your spirit and you will become wise. And Paul is saying that is not the source of wisdom. When I say you need to walk wisely, I also must quantify that and say, but not the way the pagans do it. So then how do we get wise? This is the questions the Ephesians then would have. We've always been told our whole life, if we want to be wise, then we're going to go have a drunken feast to the God of wisdom, and then We'll become wise. So if Paul's telling us to become wise, how do Christians become wise? Where does this wisdom come from? Well, it has to come from without. Wisdom isn't getting in touch with yourself. So Paul's going to deal with that. Now, just like we saw when he talked about walking in love, he's going to show that there are things about how you become wise that are completely unintuitive. It's not what we would think. It's not like go to school and read the Bible 100 times, and he doesn't say these things. Look what he says very quickly. He says three main things. He says singing, making melody in your hearts, giving thanks, being thankful, which was what he also said about walking in love. Thankfulness keeps coming up as being a very key component to deeper Christian living, and submitting yourselves one to another. These are the three things he says. This is how you become wise. This is how you come to know what the will of God is. For the Ephesians, you knew what the will of God was through drunken revelry. What is it for Christians? He says, it's not that. It's not drunkenness. For a Christian, the first thing you do is you start making continual, melodious, optimistic encouragement. He didn't say get around and lambaste each other. Rebuke each other every Sunday and Wednesday, and every time you rebuke each other and berate each other. He didn't say that. He didn't even say kindly exhort each other. He says, you want wisdom? Get together and have melodious singing and harmony in your hearts before God. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote, God sent his singers upon earth with songs of sadness and of mirth, that they might touch the hearts of men and bring them back to heaven again. Victor Hugo said, music expresses that which cannot be said, but on which it is impossible to be silent. Why is it that music is a path to wisdom? This is really important to understand. Our modern society has put such emphasis on didactic knowledge, on like speaking, like I'm doing right now. Like this is where you're going to learn something. And after I've been preaching for a very long time, longer than probably it appears because I look so young. But I've been preaching for a long time. And one thing I've come to realize is nobody ever remembers anything I say or anything anyone else says for the most part. People say, oh, I heard a good sermon. And I'll always ask them, well, what was it about? They don't know. But they never forget songs. I remember in my daughter's wedding, the DJ got everybody around in a circle. And he says, you all know this song. And he starts playing a song. And I was the only one who didn't know it. Never heard it before in my life. And everyone's like, what was it? Don't stop believing, or what is it? Yeah, something like that. I never heard it. But everybody else there knew all the lyrics of it. They couldn't have told me what the sermon was the Sunday before. But they remember a song they heard in the 70s. There's a reason why music is powerful. It is powerful. Because music is dealing with a multi-laminated reality. It's saying there's more than just what you can hear expressed in words. There's music and there's feeling, and it's touching your mind and your soul, and it's a full body experience and goes beyond the body, transcends that. Paul says, we're going to communicate wisdom through song. You know, he's not the first one to come up with that idea. Moses taught the Israelites songs as doctrine. Because they would remember that. They would forget the 10 Commandments, but they would sing the song of Moses. You may think your children sitting in church aren't paying attention. That's not true. They may not think they're paying attention. But you can't sit and listen to the same songs being sung about the same doctrines over and over, Sunday after Sunday, and they don't have a deep, profound effect on you. And it's the principles and the realities that are built into this music and built into that, not just singing with your voice in that sense of an overt singing, but the whole optimistic, joyful approach to Christ. We think of when it says sing, it's just saying have a hymnal. That's not what he's saying. It's making melody in our hearts. It's Christians having an entirely different approach to reality. One that could only be called a song. He says it's also constant, humble thankfulness. We talked about this. I won't go too much into it, but we talked about this 2 weeks ago. But thankfulness is incredibly important because it emphasizes, it demands of you to acknowledge dependence, limitation, self-insufficiency. It demands of it. It's what thank you means. It's why you are not wasting your time when you teach your kid, quote unquote, manners. It's not manners. You're teaching them incredibly important rules in life, that they are insufficient and they need help and they are dependent and other people are responsible for their well-being as well. And all of that is wrapped up in the practice of saying thank you. You know, we think that these things, singing and saying thank you, these are just, it doesn't seem like they're doing much. They're doing deep things in our lives when we practice them. Think of the movie The Karate Kid, when Daniel-san first goes to Mr. Miyagi, wants to learn karate, and so he puts him to build the fence and paint the house and wax the car and sand the deck. And he's getting very frustrated because he says, I wanted to learn karate, and all you're teaching me, all you're getting out of me is free work. And then Mr. Miyagi, it's all comedic, I realize this, but he shows him that, wax the car. If he actually learned a karate move. Now that's done for comedic effect, but we do this all the time. We break down complicated things to learn and put them into other contexts where they're easy to learn. For instance, team sports has long been a tradition in this country because we believe it teaches certain aspects of character. Not that we care so much. Now we care a lot about football. But originally, it wasn't looked at as football being the thing. That's why there was such a derision towards professional sports. You weren't supposed to play sports for money. That was not a real job. That was what you did as a child to learn to be a man, to then go out into the real world and do real work. That's how it was looked at. So people who wanted to earn money playing sports were considered man-childs. Because that's how they looked at sports. Sports was a way, and I'm not advocating for either side. I'm making the case that they would make. Don't think that means I believe it. Anyways, but the point I'm trying to make is this. It holds. Why are we singing? Why are we giving thanks? How is that so? How can that lead to wisdom? This is the thing. When we do these small activities that don't seem to be very valuable or very meaningful or have great answers, we find it builds in us the character that Langdon Gilkey said was missing in his camp. Where you had all these very brilliant people, but so many of them were lacking in moral integrity, moral character. And while they could solve all their technological problems, they couldn't solve the real problems. Because it required more than knowledge. It required wisdom. And wisdom, you don't get it in a school. The last thing Paul says is that we become wise through universal, mutual, voluntary submission. I'm not going to go in a lot in that because we're going to start next week talking about this submission, because this is the gateway text. All the commentators practically say this, that it's not just the end of this sentence or end of this paragraph. It actually just opens right up into the next whole section that is all about explaining what that means. What do you mean? In fact, it's such a strange, such a shocking statement that many people just reject it outright and try to say, well, it just doesn't mean what it says. But this is what he says: submitting yourselves one to another, universal, mutual submission. Now, why would that be so important for wisdom? Well, the ultimate enemy of wisdom is leaning on your own understanding. You're not wise in yourself. Nobody is. You only are wise from without. Wisdom is being able to see things with other eyes. That's what really wisdom comes down to. When I can look at a situation that I'm in, but as if it's not me, I can look at it detached, objectively. You can't see things objectively on your own. You need other people's opinions. But it doesn't do any good if you don't submit to them, because it's like what Paul says. He says we need to be wise, knowing the will of God. And people say, I want to know the will of God, but he never reveals it to me. Well, that's because you only want to sample it. You say, I want to taste it and I want to decide whether or not I'm going to like it. You know why? Let me try to put it this way. I need to kind of finish up here, wrap up. But if you're not incredibly successful in some area of your life, there are people around you, probably you're not aware that they're there, who could tell you how to be successful. Now, I've had a few opportunities, not many, but a couple opportunities, where I could be a mentor to somebody in my line of work, which isn't very impressive, right? I can tell them how to properly install toilet paper dispensers and actually make money at it. Because I actually do pretty well at that. I'm pretty good at that. It's not, believe me, it's not going to get us to the moon. But, you know, after the double bean cheese burrito, you're thankful to me, not to NASA. Okay, so, but you say, well, you know what I found is that, and by seeing this, I see it then in myself. I can't help them because they don't want to submit. They don't want to be helped. And what most wise people, I think, and I don't think I'm one of them, but I think because of that little glimpse I get, I think most wise people in this world and in this country and in our city, they just don't tell anybody anything. And it's not because they're stingy or selfish. It's because we, the ignorant people, will just bite their hand off because we don't want to be told anything. We're going to figure it out all on our own. Wisdom is learning from other people's mistakes. The only way that works is if you're willing to submit yourself to somebody else. And you don't get to choose who they are. Paul says we got these three things, which seem very counterintuitive, but he says this is how we can come together as a community and discover what the will of God is, and that will be wisdom in our life. It won't be answers. It'll be something better. The Bible, no matter how big it would have been written, would have never answered all your questions. But wisdom will deal with all your issues. Wisdom will. But wisdom's hard. Wisdom is hard. It's harder than becoming rich. That's why when Solomon got wisdom, he got everything else. Wisdom's hard. But that's what we've been called to. Paul says you need to walk wisely. You say, well, how am I going to do that? Start having a very optimistic, melodious community spirit around Christ in you. Stop complaining about everything, criticizing everything, finding what's wrong in everything. Why don't you start having, and this I say to myself, think about everything that's good and pure and right. And you're not sure how to have a melodious spirit, you can start by just singing some songs with your mouth. And the action actually translates down. It actually burrows down into you. And start being thankful. Instead of being angry or indignant or self-sufficient, acknowledge that you are here, that you have succeeded because others have invested in you. And be thankful. And start submitting to everybody else. So when someone comes and tells you you're wrong, say, you're right. You're right. I don't see how I'm wrong. Like Mike, he says, if I thought I was wrong, I would change it. I'd be right. So I'm right. I'm going to say, you're wrong. Say, I'm wrong. That's hard to say. It's the hardest thing in the world to say. I'm right. Submit yourselves to others. Just accept that your opinion is mostly wrong. That's super hard. The moment you start accepting that you're mostly wrong, paradoxically, you'll start being mostly right. It's incredible how this works. And then we will begin, and this is not an individual thing. Paul makes that very clear. This is a community endeavor. But as a Christian community, he's saying, you'll begin to understand what the will of God is. All together, not one person, not off on your own isolated, but all together, you'll begin to learn and understand what the will of God is and apply that in your lives, and you'll begin to find the answers you need to every situation. Let's close with prayer. Father, we're thankful for your word. We're thankful for the wisdom that it leads us to, that through it we can come to understand and know what your will is. I ask that as we go out this week, that if anything sticks in our minds on this, that it would be that we're to be joyful and peaceful and harmonious and have a love and optimism about you and your doctrine and your truth and your person, that we would that our whole hearts would lift itself in song to you throughout the day. That we would have that optimism that you have the words of truth and life. And I ask that you'd help us to break out of the bad habit of complaining, of murmuring, and be thankful to you, to our families, to our government, to our neighbors, to our coworkers, our bosses, that we would just be a thankful people. That we have received far more than we deserve, and we've been chastised far less than we should have been. And that we'd be just the most thankful people on earth, because we think we're just the luckiest people on earth. And that we would learn to be submissive one to another. Stop angling and fighting and pushing for our own way, for our own selfish desires. That we would just learn to submit and give in and accept that other people, no matter how much we dislike them or they dislike us, that they can actually see our situation with clearer eyes than we can see it ourselves. And I ask you for all of this in the name of Jesus, for whom I give thanks, to whom I sing eternal hallelujah. Amen. Glad you were here. I will see you next week.